I'm going to suggest the absence of quorum unless somebody else seeks recognition. President, I see the distinguished senator from Florida on the floor, and I would yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Thank you. I just want to echo my support for the amendment that basically is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Human trafficking is an issue that people would be shocked at its prevalence, both in our country and around the world. The idea of slavery and human slavery is something that people think about as a historical issue, something that happened a long time ago. The fact of the matter is that it is happening today. It is happening all over the world, and it is happening here in the United States. And it's a tragic issue. And it's not just sex trafficking, which gets all the attention, and obviously it's something that is very bad, but it's also labor trafficking. There are people in this country that are brought in under false pretenses, and when they come here, they don't get paid. They're mistreated, and they're threatened on many occasions that their family back home is going to be hurt if they go to the authorities. We've had cases of this happening in Florida. We've seen horrible cases documented in Florida of this, and this is one of the issues that I've really become passionate about, and anyone would become passionate about if ever you meet some of these survivors, some of these young women and young men who have survived some of the most brutal treatment that you can imagine. So I would just say that this is a great step in terms of reauthorizing not just this bill, but America's example to the world that we take this issue seriously. But I also think this is an issue of awareness. And in the years to come, I hope that we'll continue to talk about this issue because there is still there's a lack of awareness in this country among many people about how serious this problem truly is. And I'm just grateful that this hopefully will be able to move forward. And I want to thank the Senator for offering this amendment. Should I yield the floor or suggest the absence of the floor?
Mr. President, before you do, I appreciate the strong support of the senator from Florida on this. He has been a voice of reason and consistency in this area, and I appreciate it. And I'd suggest the absence of quorum at the time equally divided.
Objection, so ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. sound.
I ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask permission to speak as in morning business for 8 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Yeah. I want to speak about a bill I'm introducing today that's related to the Farm Bill. It deals with reforming payment limits for farm programs. As one looks back to the fall of 2011, and the failure of what is referred to as a super committee at that time, we saw many committees continue on business as usual. However, one committee's members took it upon themselves to continue efforts to tackle spending and propose meaningful reductions of expenditures, and that was the Senate Agriculture Committee. For that matter, the House Agriculture Committee work towards that end as well, and I commend Chairman Stabenow and then Ranking Member Roberts for corralling the many ideas of the members of the committee to write a bill that actually reduced expenditures by $23 billion. We were able to work in committee to get the bill done. We were able to work in a bipartisan manner to get the bill to the Senate floor and pass with a bipartisan majority. It is how legislation is supposed to be considered and debated in the Senate floor, something we refer to as regular order. One of the measures in last year's Farm Bill was my proposal reforming payment limitations to farm programs. Adopting reform to payment limitations contributed to this $23 billion of savings that I already mentioned. Beyond just being a part of saving money, these reforms help ensure farm payments go to those who they were originally intended, small and medium-sized farmers. There are many reforms that can be made to save money, but we have to try to save more money, but I want to concentrate now, rather than going into some of those things, and I'll put that portion of my remarks in the record, and talk about the bill I'm introducing. When we do move forward on drafting a new farm bill, I will again be pushing for the reforms to payment limitations. That's why today I'm introducing the Farm Program Integrity Act of 2013 with Senators Johnson of South Dakota, Senator Enzi, and Senator Brown. The proposed legislation strikes a needed balance of recognizing the need for farm safety net while making sure that we have a defensible and responsible safety net. In case there's any doubt, we do need a farm program safety net. For those who argue that we do not need such a safety net for our farmers, I argue that they do not understand the dangers of the nation which do not produce enough food to feed their people. Take Germany and Japan during World War II, for instance. There came a point where their soldiers had difficulty fighting because they didn't have food to eat. So today, their respective governments of Germany and Japan maintain a vigorous support for their farmers. It's a matter of social cohesion as well. Without a secure source of food, we jeopardize our very way of life, and all you have to do is look around the world where there is hunger and you see rioting, stealing, and other acts of violence. So we need our farmers to keep producing food, not only for here, but what we export as well. For all the advances in modern agriculture, farmers are still subject to conditions out of their control. Just look at the drought that still grips much of the United States. Without an adequate safety net, some farmers would be left with no ability to make it the following year. That would mean potentially less food being produced for an ever-increasing world population, and that ought to be a scary prospect. While farmers need a safety net, there does come a point where a farmer gets big enough or financially secure enough he can weather tough times without much assistance from the government. Somehow, though, over the years, there has developed this perverse scenario where big farmers are receiving the largest share of the farm programs. We now have the largest 10% of the farmers receiving nearly 70% of the assistance under the Farm Bill. There's nothing wrong with farmers growing his operation. That's the American way. But the taxpayer should not be subsidizing large farming operations to grow even larger. By having reasonable caps on the amount of farm program payments any one farmer can receive, it helps ensure the program meets the intent of assisting small and medium-sized farmers through tough times. My proposed caps on payment will also help encourage the next generation of rural Americans to take up farming. I'm approached time and again about how to keep young people into farming. With large farmers able to use farm program payments to drive up the cost of land and rental rates, our farm programs end up hurting those that are meant to help, particularly getting young farmers started. It is simply good policy to have a hard cap on the amount of a single farmer can receive in the farm program. We will keep in place a much-needed safety net for farmers who need it, and it will help reduce the negative impact of farm payments have on land prices. Our bill sets an overall cap of $250,000 for married couples. In my state, many people would say that that's still too high, but we have to recognize that agriculture is different in different parts of the country. So this has been a figure that has worked as a national compromise. Just as important to setting a hard cap on payments is closing off loopholes that will allow non-farmers to game the farm program. The bill being introduced today will do this by cutting off the ability of these non-farmers from abusing what is referred to through the words, quote, unquote, actively engaged in farming. In essence, the law says one has to be actively engaged in farming to qualify for farm payments. However, this has been exploited by people who have virtually nothing to do with a farming operation, yet receive payments from the farm program. Our nation has a $16 trillion debt. We cannot afford to simply look the other way and let the people abuse the farm program. The Farm Program Integrity Act of 2013, the bill that I'm speaking about, is the same in purpose as what it states in its name. This is about increasing the integrity of the farm program. My colleagues here in the Senate agreed with me last year as we included this pivotal program in the Farm Bill. I am confident that these reforms will garner similar approval in this new Congress. I mentioned earlier how we need to assess some of the challenging areas of farm policy as we look to pass a five-year farm bill, and some tough decisions need to be made. However, my proposed reform regarding payment limits do not pose a tough decision. In fact, they're very common sense and necessary reforms. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum and permission to put my entire statement in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Okay.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
President, I ask consent that the call of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, we're going to vote in just a couple of minutes. But I would reiterate what I said earlier. This is going to be a vote in the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. It was a bill that was written with the input of victims and service providers. Last year we had 57 co-sponsors, including 15 Republicans. And I do want to thank Senator Rubio, who was on the floor a few minutes ago speaking about it. And I couldn't help but think, as I said earlier, when I looked at the calendar today, February 12th, day on which Abraham Lincoln was born. 150 years ago, they delivered the Emancipation Proclamation. Wouldn't it be great if the Senate passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act on President Lincoln's birthday? I also said earlier today that the Senate should be, often is, the conscience of the nation. I have to imagine that the conscience of the vast majority of our 300 million Americans, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or liberals, moderates, conservatives, independents, their conscience would rebel against the idea of really slave trafficking, whether it's people trapped in sex trade or in factories where they face the possibility if there's a fire, they're all going to die because they're forced to be there. Let's speak. Let's speak to the conscience of this country. And, Mr. President, have the yeas and nays been ordered on my amendment?
They have not.
President, I'd ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I yield back all time.
Without objection, so ordered. The question is on amendment number 21 as modified. The yeas and nays were previously ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson.
So we are voting on Leahy.
Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
And then Coburn is already passed.
Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk.
I can't believe John's always going to go work for Google. That's crazy.
Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu.
Make it the top.
Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee.
Yeah. And then
Mr. Levin.
yeah.
Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Barrasso, Blumenthal, Blunt, Boxer, Burr, Corker, Cornyn, Grassley, Heitkamp, Leahy, McConnell, Rockefeller, Schatz, Thune, Toomey, and Vitter. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Harkin? Mr. Harkin? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Cowan? Mr. Cowan? Aye. Mr. Cochran? Mr. Cochran? Aye. Mr. Isaacson? Mr. Isaacson? Aye. Mr. Hatch? Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Manchin? Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? Mr. Chambliss? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mrs. Hagan? Mrs. Hagan? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Aye. Mr. King? Mr. King? Aye. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Cardin? Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham? Aye. Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Coates? Aye. Mr. Coates? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Donnelly? Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Mr. Franken? Mr. Franken? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown? Aye. Mr. Kirk? Mr. Kirk? Aye. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans? Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake? Aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn? No. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich? Aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono? Aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Lautenberg? Mr. Lautenberg? Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker? Aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson? Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller? Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Ms. Landrieu? Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Enzi? Mr. Enzi? Aye.
Good count.
Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio? Aye. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul? Aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? No.
Is she, is
Ms. Klobuchar? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their vote? Hearing none, the Leahy Amendment number 21. The yeas are 93. The noes are 5. The amendment is agreed to.
Move to reconsider. Lay on the table.
Without objection?
Lay on the table.
Without objection?
I want to get order and keep working.
This will.
Okay.
Tim?
I don't either.
President Reed, Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
parliamentary inquiry, are we now on,
Senate will come to order.
under the previous order, we are now on amendment number 10.
The amendment has not been made pending. Senator from Ohio.
I call up Amendment 10.
Without objection, the clerk will report the amendment.
Senator from Ohio, Mr. Portman, proposes
I ask
amendment
unanimous
number
consent that
10.
the reading be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this is a common sense amendment. We just voted on the VAWA amendment for trafficking that Senator Leahy offered. This is an amendment that deals actually with the underlying legislation. It's really a clarifying amendment. I'm pleased to be joined by Senator Blumenthal, Ayotte, Collins, Brown, Cochran, Rubio, Alexander, and Gillibrand. It has to do with offering protection and services to victims of child sex trafficking under VAWA. This simply says that under Section 302 of VAWA that we ensure that sex trafficking is covered. Right now, youth and children who are exposed to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking are covered, but not sex trafficking. I think it's consistent with the amendment we just passed, but it's
Senate will come to order.
also an important clarification of the underlying bill. There are about 300,000 young Americans that the FBI say are at risk today of this, and this is a common-sense approach to it. I would hope that all senators on both sides of the aisle can agree that sex trafficking should be covered by this act.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I agree with Senator Howe. I'm perfectly willing to accept this amendment by a voice vote, and I do support it.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to thank again the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, our distinguished colleague Patrick Leahy, for his leadership on this bill and on the issue of human trafficking. He has led this chamber, and I want to thank my colleague Senator Portman for truly a common-sense amendment that aims to combat one of the great scourges in the United States and around the world, sex trafficking involving young people. We can take a strong step and send a strong message by providing the kinds of services to young victims as we do to other victims who receive aid under VAWA, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Senator, time has expired.
For the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Landrieu, aye.
Ms. Ayotte.
Thank you.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Rubio. Sir. Bitter. Brown. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Schumer. Sir. Byron. Portman. Hatch. Manchin. Sir. Sir. Blumenthal. Sir. Schatz. Murray. Sure, thank you. Reed. Empty. Sure. Murphy. Scala. Sure. Thank you. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Thank you. Baldwin. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Sir. Thanks. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Sir. Gotcha. Gotcha. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Sir. Thank you. Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons. Sir. Sir. Horn. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo. Mr. Heller. Thanks. Gotcha. Yes. Mr. Cruz. Okay, got you both. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi.
Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Thank you. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar. Sir, thank you. Ms. Landry, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. Durbin. Gotcha. Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Crapo, Harkin, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Begich, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Cowan, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Grassley, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Hoven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Mikulski, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Paul, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Scott, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Vitter, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. If you want to mark the page and just slip it in there. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or who wish to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 100, the noes are 0. And the amendment is agreed to.
Madam President,
Senator from Vermont,
move to reconsider.
Senate will come to order.
Table.